For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh. Revi. On the 100th episode of Talking Point, we're looking at the immediate and wider ramifications of President Putin's war in Ukraine. On the 100th episode, our expert today is Dr. Raja Mohan. He's currently a senior fellow with the Asia Society Policy Institute at New Delhi. Dr. Mohan, thank you so much for giving us some time. There's been months of this build-up and warnings. Blood is now being spilled. But when you look at the speeches from President Putin that have been played, pretty chilly warnings of consequences of anybody who opposes what he's doing. When you look at his speeches, history, KGB, the Soviet era, the Russian Empire, how do you see what's happened in the last few days?
So I think there's been a significant underestimation of what Putin wanted. And many of us, I think, thought that this military buildup was a leverage to negotiate something. But quite clearly, for all the things he said, look, we have no intention to invade, etc. He had clearly wanted to wipe out Ukraine as a map, from the map, as a state. That though he said things like that Ukraine never had an independent statehood, it has no right to be a separate state, and Ukraine can be sovereign only in association with Russia. So I think we all probably did not read accurately what he was thinking. That this is not just about a grievance about NATO, because Ukraine's integration into NATO was by no means imminent, and everyone had assured them that it's not going to happen. But yet, for him, I think the big project is not the restoration of the Soviet Union, but I think it is the restoration of the Russian Empire. And that's why I think many people did not notice in India, which is really his critique of Lenin. That actually Lenin talked about the nationalities, and that Lenin was a strong critique of Russian chauvinism, the big Russian chauvinism. And that Lenin insisted that, look, Russia has many nationalities, and that each one has a right to have their own separate, within a large confederal type of system. And that's also the reason why Stalin put Ukraine as a member of the United Nations General Assembly. So for him, those were huge mistakes. So for him, what he's looking at is really to reintegrate the Russian Empire. And I think under the flag of the great Russian Empire. So this is, I think, very serious. And this also means that the future of Belarus would be a significant stake, and that he wants to really, really either, not that he doesn't have to occupy all of them. They all must be protectorates of Russia, which is what he wants. But this, I think, locks him in both huge contestation with Europe, and no country can do this. You can get away with it. Like India, if India says, look, we were one country before partition, you can say, look, I had a historic grievance, Nehru made a mistake, Gandhi made a mistake. But today you can't undo history. But I think this way, Putin thinks he can use military means to undo history.
But in this particular case, when you're saying it, the grievance is not necessarily against NATO's expansion, Ukraine itself, it's certainly not about Donbass, Donetsk, Luhansk. The idea is to, in the American terminology now, decapitate the Ukrainian government.
Yeah, most probably. I think because he's got complete dominance of the military, and I think he's invited the Ukrainian forces to surrender. So at this point, my speculation is that he would have another regime in place, because the current regime will collapse. He'll put someone who's loyal to Russia. And if you go back to 2013-14, that was the real issue. That the regime, that the switch between one regime to another, and the attempt of one faction in Ukraine to reach out to European Union and NATO, while the Russia has objected to it. And I think that's where the crisis began. But now he'll have a free hand. He'll set up a regime. But the real story is after that what? That, okay, you get control of Ukraine. Because there are divisions within Ukraine. Just as there are divisions between Russia and Ukraine. Within Ukraine, there are two religious groups. the Russian Orthodox Church, which is closer to Russia. You have the Roman Catholic Church, which is close to Poland. So the tension between Kiev and Lvov, which is on the western side of Ukraine, is real. And I think Ukraine's own history was one that it, our Russian friends claim, look, it always belonged to us. But the history of Ukraine was torn between multiple empires, certainly between Polish Empire and the Russian Empire. So there will be a section that's not going to be happy with this.
Zelensky has gone on record to say the Iron Curtain, that's the sound of the Iron Curtain falling again. But do you see this ending swiftly, or as some analysts in the West say, that the Russians will be in a quagmire?
No, I think this is the beginning of the end or end of the beginning. So I suspect it is just the end of the beginning, that he'll take control of Ukraine. And then the way the rest of the world, particularly NATO and US, react they're going to step up efforts now to draw a line at this place, strengthen NATO. And they're already deploying troops in the Baltic countries. Look, if you're in Lithuania, Latvia, or they will be very worried about what Russia might do to them. If you're Poland, in fact, I would say watch Poland very closely. They have huge stakes in this. And for them, it's important to strengthen NATO. So you're going to have actually, Putin might have achieved that a NATO that was kind of was not agreed on many things, is going to now be a lot more united. So the Central Europe, which is where the contestation is. Does Russia reclaim its past territories, or the West, where does it defend? Does Central Europe become a buffer? Does it become a line that simply separates the two sides? So I think we are. So I would say, really looking at the Central European perspectives after this will be key, and whether the West will support. If there is a resistance in Ukraine, will they support an insurgency? All those issues will come.
The debate going on of the legality of supplying arms there, what do the Russians do? When you're saying Russian Empire of old, I'm not belittling the situation that Ukrainians are in right now, but just looking forward. I mean, it could be Kaliningrad, you want a land border between Poland and then Lithuania is involved, and then go into the larger issue. But in terms of the West saying that we knew this was happening, we were trying to preempt every move of his, sanctions that have been imposed and whatever they have in abeyance is, yes, swift and absolutely severe is what they said. Swift, not the swift sanction. How do you see the sanctions regime operating in terms of Russian behavior?
See, before we get to the sanctions question, I think quite clearly the West has not been able to deter Putin from invading, not just taking Luhansk and Donetsk, but actually taking across the whole country. And they simply stepped back and abandoned Ukraine in some sense to its fate. So if the sanctions did not really, threat of sanctions did not deter Russia, will the actual round of sanctions, what kind of a damage will they do for Russian economy? I mean, Russia is vast country. There will be costs, but the problem is the costs will also affect Europe. And that's why the Europeans are opposed to having SWIFT, that is the global financial.
The Italians don't want luxury goods.
Yeah. I mean, so it's each one has their own interests. So it's never easy to run a coalition against a determined challenger. So each one has their own interests. And then geography makes Germany interdependent with Russia. Because Germany has cancelled Nord Stream 2, but Nord Stream 2 is not operational. But the whole of Europe depends on Russia for 50% of gas supplies. So if that's what Putin is threatening, you put sanctions, I'm going to choke you off on gas. Because he'll also have to pay a cost because where will he get his money from? So I think you're going to have actually a situation where can the US and the West really impose serious costs without hurting the Europeans? And this is what many of us thought, given the scale of the costs, that both sides will be able to find a settlement of accommodation, of finding a new security order. But few of us saw the scale of Putin's ambition. So this is going to squeeze a whole lot of them in Europe. So the sanctions so far that have been unveiled, I mean, we have to see the legal print, I mean, in terms of what specifically will they target.
And it'll take time
to actually see the actual decisions codified by the governments.
But he's obviously gamed it out. I mean, in his speeches, he said sanctions will be sanctioned either way, whether we do it or not. A huge forex reserve has been built up, I think, over $450 billion. Gas prices over $100 a barrel. I mean, again, who will pay him, etc. But the costs on Russia, how do you see that going forward over time?
Yeah, in the long term, yes. But in the near
I mean, he's also counting on the fact that there won't be any unity, right?
Yeah.
In
a sense, I think he's prepared for this well. I mean, now in retrospect, I mean, the last 4-5 years, high oil prices has boosted its revenue. And when he took charge from Yeltsin, Russian military was in a bad shape. He's restored the strength of the Russian military. He sharpened the cyber attack skills. So I think he completed a fairly significant military modernization. He's ended the economic chaos which Yeltsin had left. So the population is, okay, there are a lot of objections, protesters, dissidents, but largely it has worked for him. I mean, that he's managed to stabilize Russian economy, built up the reserves, as you mentioned, and modernize the military. So now he's trying to cash in on that. But over the longer term, look, Russia's GDP all said and done is $1.6 trillion. Yeah. Europe is 16. The US is more than 22, 24. So I think in the longer term, what old days the Marxists would have said, the correlation of forces. Over the long term, they're loaded against Russia, provided the West is united. That's where Putin would want to exploit the divisions within the West, and he would play that card, but and also play the China card. So I think he's gambled that he can ride this through.
When you're talking about NATO and Russia's security concerns, which everyone says they are security concerns, what happened post 2014, I mean, not implemented the Minsk agreements, etc. But in this day and age, as you pointed out earlier, what is the message going out if a country or a leader can actually do what he's done, which is send in military might across sovereign borders?
Which is not very different from what Xi Jinping has done this side. I mean, this is the ultra-nationalists who say, look, we have a historic grievance. We are taking the lands that belong to us. So Xi Jinping says, look, the whole of South China Sea is Chinese territory. So I don't care for the law of the sea. That doesn't matter. This belongs to me. So I'm just taking what belongs to me. That was also the argument Xi Jinping had when they said, look, on the Ladakh, we're just going back to our claim line in 1959. So this is really ours. So what are you complaining about? So I think the calculation that the West is divided and that there will be no decisive counter move. So has given them confidence, both for President Putin and President Xi, both of them around, plan to be there for a long time. So I think they're willing to risk a lot. But like all strong men, there is always a danger of miscalculating because typically democracies take longer time to organize. They're more chaotic, they're more divided internally in each country and between a coalition of democracies. So initially it looked very chaotic. That's the story of the Second World War. But eventually, if the West gets its act together, their capacity to mount economic pressure on Russia would be huge. So I think that is so longer term, this deck is stacked against Putin. But in the near term, it will look like he's won a major victory here. And he'll be more confident in the near term.
But then these two ultra-nationalist leaders are being pushed together because of these circumstances. What are the ramifications of that?
It's very interesting. I mean, the Chinese have been very cautious in, they're criticizing the West, but they're not really endorsing actions of Putin because for them, look, what Russia has done with the republics, with the so-called, first you prop up a regime, you arm them, you create an insurgency, and then you say, these are independent republics, and then you begin to recognize them, get a letter from them saying, come and help us. No, for China, and equally for India, China has a problem of Xinjiang. China has a problem of Tibet. India has a problem of Kashmir, and we have thousands of other insurgencies going on in different frontiers of India. So what a country does, look, I will play in your territory, I'll create an insurgency, I'll back them, which is when there's not much difference between you have Pakistan saying Azad Kashmir, and you have Putin saying, look, these were independent republics that have asked me to intervene. So I think because those who are beginning to put together countries, it's very, you can't really endorse the action. Well, for different political reasons, both China and India might keep quiet, but this fundamentally threatens their internal unity. So there is that problem. for China. So therefore, China is navigating three contradictions. One, it has an alliance, de facto alliance with China. Second, it has a long tradition of non-interference in the internal affairs where we absolute sovereignty. And the third is, can you use this to leverage this, your economic relationship? You don't want to jeopardize the economic relationship with Europe and the West. And fourth, is there an opportunity here, which is to try to turn the Americans, look, you have a Russia problem, why are you fighting here? Let's make a deal. And if you see, this week, as you know, was the 50th anniversary of Nixon's visit to China. So if you read the Chinese newspapers last week, they were saying, look, that was a fantastic thing. US and China got together despite the differences. We must keep that spirit alive. Let's get back together. So in a sense, we used to talk about Russia being pushed into the Chinese arms. That's only partly true. In fact, China now has the leverage to negotiate with the Americans better. So it actually empowers China vis-a-vis Russia, because Russians are weaker. It opens a door for the Chinese vis-a-vis America and the West. And it'll put more squeeze on us, India.
Absolutely. And of course, Xi Jinping, as you mentioned, has already been doing this, whether it's the South China Sea, whether it's Ladakh, Taiwan itself. I mean, they're watching it closely to see how the West reacts and how internally, I mean, of course, there are different dynamics in Taiwan and Donbass, but how it's dealt with, right?
No, I think the Western headlines are focused on, Taiwan. Ukraine versus Taiwan. But look, I think we should look at somewhere else. We should look at Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh. The Japanese are looking at, their maritime disputes and the Senkaku and the various islands they have.
And impose sanctions.
So while the focus is on, look, he's already shown you, Xi Jinping, that he can salami slice, keep nudging into the Indian territory. So I think that's much easier to do than Taiwan. And the world is not going to react as badly to one more thin sliver cut out of Ladakh or India. So I think we should not get into that debate of Taiwan versus Ukraine, but we should look at the implications for the border security on Arunachal and Ladakh. So I think our focus should be there, whether anything is beginning to happen. And there, I think, if I have a second, which is really, we are trapped in a situation where Chinese can ramp up military pressure on us at any time they want. And we are turning to Russia to save us from China and give us the military supplies. And China and Russia are best friends. So one guy can put military pressure on you, and the other guy says, okay, I'm your best savior in this moment. I can also talk to Xi Jinping about you. So this is really a terrible situation that India has caught itself in, that once Russia and China have got together, that our position is going to get a lot more delicate.
And how do you see how we've reacted so far publicly? And you've seen what's happened in the UNSC so far. There's a draft resolution that's going around with the Americans will want to vote on as well.
Look, in the old days, diplomat Mani Dixit, who was the former foreign secretary, he used to say, whenever you're caught in a tricky situation like this, that Indian diplomacy does a Bharatanatyam. One foot here, one hand there, one mudra here. So you kind of, do all kinds of calisthenics to wriggle out of a situation. So which is what we're doing, Bharatanatyam of a kind in a diplomatic sense. But my thing, look, the challenge is not, okay, people will criticize you if you kind of abstain or if you don't take clear positions. But India has a problem, therefore you can explain that. But the real problem for India will be the day after. That is, once the sanctions begin to bite, what are our answers? So this is real stuff, because today India is not at the 70s. On the economic side, you have a massive trade with US, massive trade with Europe. With Russia, our trade is only 10 billion. Actually, Russia, there's very little economic, we get some natural gas. But the real problem is, look, if the sanctions complicate our economic relationship with the West, so navigating that is one part. Second is on the defense side. There are commitments made to buy a whole lot of things. So what do we do? How do we manage that? So those are the real problems. While the optics of where India is standing, is it voting with or for against the resolution? Did it suddenly disappear from the room to when the voting took place? No, that's a diplomatic problem, but not a strategic problem. The strategic problem is how do we navigate the sanctions that are going to come? And the other is how do we deal with the consequence of US-China-Russia partnership on what it means for our frontiers? Therefore, our military dependence on Russia is the key. Because in the past, we used to say, oh, Russians will use the veto on Kashmir for us. But today, the West is not interested in Kashmir. That problem is not there. But it's only the military supplies. So can we reduce our dependence? In the near term, no. But the government has started this whole policy of self-reliance. But all that will take time. So is there a strategy to increase your domestic production on the key weapons, equipment, ammunition? But those answers, is there any new ways in which we can do that? Because as long as you're dependent on Russia, on weapons, your ability to, stand up on principle will be very difficult. While China and Russia are going to get together even more. So which really a jugalbandi that's going to put us in a deep trouble.
So in a sense, you're saying China has more leverage because of what has happened, say vis-a-vis the West, but we are caught between a rock and a hard place.
Exactly, in multiple ways. That as long as it was, Russia was not a problem, the American focus was on Indo-Pacific, right? I mean, they all say, look, that's not going to change. But the fact is, Russia is a distraction. And then for us, the China is a principal problem. Now, Russia has put itself as a major problem for the West. Therefore, that is an inconvenience for us. But that's life, right? You have a problem there. So for us, one is the near-term diplomatic issues. Other longer term is if this conflict continues in Europe, which is most likely will. What will it do to, the plans for Indo-Pacific from the West? So that's one problem. And then in America, that divides its attention between Asia and Europe is always a problem. And finally, I would say, every time there was a conflict between Russia and the West, China has been the gainer. Historically, I mean, that's what happened in the Cold War. And if you go back a little further to the British Raj period, that the British Raj in Calcutta said, look, Russia was the problem, so they kept pushing at Russia. And London said, don't get too far into Tibet. Let's not provoke China. Let's give China a lot of room on Tibet. For example, the British positions on Tibet were influenced by emphasizing the Russian threat while underplaying the Chinese threat. And that left us in a sort of huge problem when independence came.
So the focus on Indo-Pacific will be a problem if this continues in Europe, you're saying definitely, and the focus against China that the world was looking at. What about, it may have been planned before, it may have been a coincidence, Imran Khan in the Kremlin, and we know the Pakistan-China nexus over the decades. What is that axis that is building up? Or is it building up?
Yeah, no, I think many in Delhi worry that, look, are we going to have a China-Russia-Pakistan axis? Because the Imran Khan's visit is a consequence of the steady improvement in the Russia-Pakistan relationship over the last decade. Ever since the larger dynamic changed, the Russians have decided, look, they're not going to just give India a veto over their Pakistan policy. We used to put a lot of pressure on them, don't do things with Pakistan. They lifted the arms embargo a few years ago. They started working with them very closely on Afghanistan. And then there was a trilateral, China, Russia, Pakistan on Afghanistan. So I think the Russians are recalculating. Look, I mean, nobody is a permanent friend, which is what, whether it's Palmerston or Mahabharata, they all tell you, nobody is a permanent friend or an enemy. So their circumstances is they see the principal problem with the West. And they're ready to accommodate China. For us, the principal problem is China. And therefore, we would expect the West to accommodate on Russia, but both of them are going to play. But within the region, Pakistan feels it has been neglected by the US, and that US has adopted an India-first policy. Therefore, they're looking to show some diversification. So there is a fit between Russia, which wants to diversify away from India, maybe from 100 and 0 to 50-50, maybe down the road, but at this point, 70-30. And Pakistan, which is historically, they love the Americans, but today they need to recalibrate a bit. By going to Russia, Imran Khan will tell the Americans, look, don't neglect me too much. If you want me to stay a little bit neutral, be nice to me. So Pakistan,
or a little bit excitable, as you said.
So I think Pakistan's leverage is also if China and Russia back them, the leverage will also go up. So I think for us, the nightmare scenario is China, Russia, Pakistan getting together. And just as in the Cold War, we had US, China, and Pakistan got together. Today, if Russia, Pakistan, and China get together, they will want to set up a counter to India in the region. And that, we are not there yet. but a potential movement in the direction will be a huge challenge.
You talked about it as diplomatic Bharatanatyam. Now, you've given the strands in terms of the costs and how India should navigate this. So how would you wrap it up in terms of the way forward for India?
Look, I think for us, one, we need to understand the fundamental changes that have taken place in Russia. The Russia today is on a path, which it feels, I mean, everybody has a historic, but is in a sense of redeeming historic claims. Whether good or bad is not the thing, that has consequences. So we should understand the nature of the Soviet state, Russian state that Putin has built. Second, I think Russia is going to be locked in a prolonged confrontation with the West. Its reliance on China is going to grow. Therefore, that has consequences for us in multiple directions. So for us, the immediate challenge is one, find ways to navigate the economic sanctions. And third, begin to take steps to reduce our reliance on Russian supplies. It should not be just Russia is going to be we are permanently tied to Russia. Therefore, I think increasing domestic production, the so-called Atmanirbhar thing on the defense side, it must be taken up on a much battle footing. Otherwise, we'll always be caught in this terrible situation.
Dr. Raja Mohan, it's always been a pleasure to pick your brains. Thanks for your expertise, your time, and your perspective.
Thank you, Amitabh. It's nice to be here with you.
Pleasure. And do keep your comments coming on this particular discussion and all our other videos. Do follow us on our YouTube channel as well. Subscribe to that if you haven't already. Like this video and share the link with your professional and personal contacts. This is The Talking Point on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.